The following is distributed by the Berean Call.
Chapter 9. Appeasement in Our Day. Democratic world powers seem at their wits' end in the futile effort to bring real peace to the Middle East. As we have documented beyond question, a major reason for failed peace efforts is the refusal of Western leaders to admit the truth, that the heart of the problem is Islam itself, and what Muslim leaders are doing in the name of Allah to foment unrest and hatred of Israel and of the West. Time and again, Israel is pressured to live at peace with and to give back yet more land to the Palestinians. But appeasement works no better now than it ever has. There is no appeasing or appealing to a mass murderer once he has the upper hand. Until we are willing to admit the truth and to state clearly to ourselves and to the world, including the Muslim world, that terrorism will not be rewarded with further concessions, the slide down the slippery slope to destruction will only gather momentum. Watching this abortive peace process, which has been going on for many years, with one American president after another trying to bring peace at last, one is reminded of Neville Chamberlain's efforts to do the same in the late 1930s in Europe. Must we learn the bitter and costly lesson again and again that appeasement, of which Chamberlain with his umbrella and winged collars has become the pitiful, mocking symbol, doesn't work? Chamberlain was sympathetic to Hitler's complaints that Germany had been badly treated after World War I, as indeed nearly everyone later agreed was true. In this case, however, with some few exceptions, Palestinians' complaints about Israeli aggression are false, and even if true, would not justify murderous terrorist attacks against Israel's civilian population. Chamberlain was confident that Hitler was a reasonable man, a trustworthy man of his word. The world treated Arafat the same way, as though he too, in spite of being the world's leading terrorist and murderer, were a man of his word to be reasoned with and trusted. Getting Arafat to sign yet another agreement was the hopeful goal when the latest arrangement wasn't working because the Palestinians were violating every provision they had promised to keep. Predictably, however, failure to achieve peace was always Israel's fault, though she attempted to abide by every new revision. Giving in to Hitler's and Mussolini's demands for a little more land to avert war in that day has a familiar ring to what has been going on in our time, the chipping away at Israel's land in order to bring a supposed peace. After visiting Germany, Lord Halifax, who became Foreign Secretary upon Anthony Eden's resignation in protest against appeasing Hitler, said that he was much impressed by the Nazi leaders and confident there would be peace after all. But the continued appeasement by Britain and France only encouraged Hitler to become bolder. As the crisis worsened and war seemed inevitable, Chamberlain announced in the House of Commons that he would make a sudden and dramatic move. He would tell Hitler he was coming to Germany to talk with him personally. All Britain cheered such courage. We've had a lot of talk in the Middle East, one courageous peace initiative after another by American presidents and other Western leaders, while the situation has only worsened. In the midst of this lengthy speech, Chamberlain was handed a note that had just arrived from Hitler, inviting him to come to Munich to meet with him, Mussolini, and French President Daladier. Hearing that marvelous news, the members of the House of Commons jumped to their feet, stood on their seats, and shouted, "Peace must now be saved, and with it, the world." How often was fresh optimism aroused by peace proposals brokered by the West between Israel and the Palestinians? And what was ever achieved except Arafat's signature on another worthless agreement he never intended to keep? Arafat's successor and longtime terrorist partner, Mahmoud Abbas, received his Ph.D. in history from the Oriental College in Moscow on the thesis that the Holocaust never took place. And now, with Hamas in charge, hope of peace short of Israel's destruction is even more a fantasy. Chamberlain returned in triumph to England from Munich after giving to Germany the industrial and fortified region of Sudetenland, all but wiping out Czechoslovakia's major defenses against the Nazis. Bravely announcing peace in our time, he was cheered for his courage and genius in achieving such a favorable agreement. As anyone with a modicum of moral courage not cowed by Hitler nor blinded by his own selfish interest should have known, Hitler was not appeased, nor would he be. Nor was Britain saved from what would turn out to be the costliest war in its history. Germany completed its intended takeover of all of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939. It was only the beginning. Peace in our time turned out to be a fool's nightmare, and the history of every attempt at peace between Israel and her Muslim neighbors has been no different, from the first ceasefire in 1948 until the present. Peace at any price? Anthony Eden warned that Britain was allowing the impression to gain currency abroad that we yield to constant pressure. Of course, he was right, and Hitler hadn't needed to exert much pressure to discover this weak lack of moral resolve. Likewise, Arafat quickly learned that in the interest of a supposed peace, the West was also willing to pay almost any price at Israel's expense when new pressure was applied. A great propaganda advantage and other rewards were reaped from the Intifada. Suicide bombers and false accusations about Israeli atrocities, such as the alleged massacre in Jenin, that the media eagerly reported, only to learn that the PLO had lied to them again. After reporting in headlines and sensational stories of eyewitness accounts that hundreds of civilians had been massacred in early April 2002 by Israeli troops in Jenin, the media was forced to admit that they had been deceived by the Palestinian propaganda machine. Reports that Israel had bombed Jenin into rubble brought protest worldwide and calls for intervention by the United Nations. The truth, as it was finally admitted, was far different. In an attempt to minimize civilian casualties, instead of using available planes and artillery, Israeli troops risked their lives taking control of Jenin by fighting door to door. Colonel Gal Hirsch, head of operations in the Central Command, declared, "Most of the Palestinians that were killed were armed terrorists. Many had explosive devices strapped to their bodies when they pretended to surrender." I regret that some Palestinian civilians were injured and some were killed. We were fighting against armed terrorists. We asked the Palestinian civilians to evacuate their homes so they would not get hurt. Some chose not to. One of many newspapers that trumpeted the bogus accounts in order to cast Israel in the worst possible light, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, finally was forced to admit that its handling of the alleged Jenin massacre had been awful, an editorial disaster, egregious stumble. The New York Times and Associated Press at last admitted that Human Rights Watch had found no evidence of a massacre. The final count for the 10 days of fierce fighting was 45 Palestinians, most of them terrorists, killed, and 23 Israeli soldiers. Yet much of the Western media continues to wait hungrily for another tantalizing story to show that the Palestinians are killing, maiming, and purposely targeting thousands of innocent civilians only because they are being forced to defend themselves from Israeli terrorism. Brigadier General Eyal Schlein, head of Army operations in the Jenin campaign, said, "It is important to emphasize that whoever uses civilians as defensive shields would pay a price for doing so. We uncovered large quantities of arms, ammunition, explosives, bombs, as well as dozens of laboratories where bombs were made. All were in residential areas, many in private homes." So many similarities. Hugh Christie, an MI6 agent based in Berlin, had reported to Britain the fact that in a private conversation, Hermann Goering had frankly admitted that Germany intended to annex all of Czechoslovakia and Austria and wanted a free hand in Eastern Europe. And did not Arafat declare plainly many times, not just in private conversation, but publicly to the entire world? And have not a host of other Arab leaders said the same for more than 50 years, that the Palestinians intended to have their own state, stretching from the Jordan to the Mediterranean, with Jerusalem as its capital? How many more times do Arafat's terrorist successors and Muslim leaders worldwide have to tell us this before we believe they really mean it, and that they will be satisfied with nothing less than Israel's destruction? Is it any less reprehensible to hand Israel over to the Arabs piece by piece than all at once? Hitler flaunted his violations of the Versailles Treaty in Europe's face by increasing his armed forces 3 times beyond the agreed limit. Following an almost identical pattern, Arafat did the same, turning what was supposed to be a domestic police force into a modern army inside Israel, capable of waging war against her from within her borders. Through Chamberlain's appeasement, Germany made a peace pact with England that gave the enemy time to build up his forces and only slightly delayed the inevitable war. Have not the results of appeasement in the Middle East been the same? The aggressor's promises are never kept, and his appetite is never satisfied. Each concession opens the door to more demands and only leads to more killing, for which Israel is always blamed. Will we never learn? Does anyone except Israel really care? As condition after condition of Versailles was broken, there were merely feeble complaints from the League of Nations, while England seemed only interested in peace for herself at any price, since others were paying the outrageous cost. The parallels to the current situation in the Middle East cannot be denied. For decades, Western powers fruitlessly attempted to appease Arafat and the Arab world. They are even more ready to do the same for his successor, Mahmoud Abbas, always at the expense of Israel's territory and security and at the cost of Israeli lives. Unwilling to believe the plain statements by Arafat and the entire Muslim world that the goal is annihilation of Israel, appeasement has been stepped up, notch after notch, in the fool's dream that eventually the Palestinians would be satisfied and make no more demands. The current roadmap to peace, which was to have been completed in 2005 but hasn't even gotten started, is one more misstep on the road of appeasement. Other similarities between now and then cannot be denied. As Hitler moved boldly with well-publicized intentions of taking over all of Czechoslovakia, Germany's calculated and wanton aggression was excused as justified reaction to violence and atrocities against Germans in Sudetenland by brutal Czech police. The reports were false, but the Nazis didn't care, nor apparently did the world that accepted them, all in the interest of peace in our time. So today, Israel, acting in self-defense, is accused of using violence against those who harbor, train, and send suicide bombers to kill her civilians. Incredibly, terrorists are believed when they charge Israel with unprovoked aggression against them, but Israel is accused of lying, no matter what she says. Under heavy pressure from world opinion, Israel has been forced to negotiate with mass murderers and to look the other way while they violate every provision of every agreement so solemnly signed. Arafat consistently flaunted his violations in the faces of Israeli leaders. Intimidated by pressure from the UN and EU, which could bankrupt it by refusing to buy its products, Israel has excused its peace partners' bad faith and continued to attempt in good faith to negotiate ceasefires in defiance of common sense. Again and again, Israel failed to hold Arafat to his word and instead appeased his greedy demands. They have permitted lies and aggression to continue without adequate response in order to make peace with those who only mouth words about peace to cover their true intentions. Hitler announced his intentions plainly. Jews were not the only people targeted for death. In 1938, Hitler said he would send his troops to the east with the command to send every man, woman, and child of Polish origin and language to death, ruthlessly and mercilessly. This is the only way to win the living space we need. Poland will be depopulated and settled by Germans. Jews, however, were his main target wherever they could be found. Germans knew very well what was happening, and so did the rest of the world. Mein Kampf earned Hitler $1 million a year in royalties because all municipalities were required to purchase it to give gratis to all newly married couples. Its chapter 11 is an unabashed diatribe against the Jew, who is described thus: he will stop at nothing. His utterly low-down conduct is so appalling that one really cannot be surprised if, in the imagination of our people, the Jew is pictured as the incarnation of Satan and the symbol of evil. Again, there is a familiar ring that resounds in the same anti-Jew, anti-Israel hate propaganda emanating from Saudi Arabia and the entire Muslim world. Whether in textbooks and other official publications, sermons in mosques, news reports on radio and television, and so on. All somehow excused as justified by the provocation of Israel's very existence in the heart of the Arab nation. In Mein Kampf, Hitler argues that the Jewish peril will be stamped out the moment the general public come into possession of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, an acknowledged fraud but still popular in Muslim circles today, and understand it. He couldn't wait for that to happen, so he planned and efficiently organized the mass extermination of Europe's Jews in special camps designed for that purpose. In Hitler's January 30th, 1939 Reichstag speech, he plainly declared that the outbreak of war would result in the annihilation of Europe's Jews. His passion to exterminate all Jews, though expressed so often and so clearly, was either not believed or it was tolerated because no one cared enough to do anything about it. Of course, after the fact, it was universally condemned in the West with the excuse that the truth about the Holocaust hadn't really been known. But that was a lie, and the professed good intentions came too late to help any of the 6 million victims. And now, what is to be done with regard to Muhammad's even clearer declaration that every Jew in the world must be killed? When will that be believed as current and irrevocable Islamic doctrine and denounced by the media and world leaders? And when will our foreign policy be based on the truth instead of cover-ups and excuses for Muslim lies? As in Hitler's time, so today, no voice is raised in the United Nations or in Europe against the clearly pronounced vows of Muslim leaders that an entire people must be exterminated. Naively, Muhammad's unequivocal statement is treated as though it no longer applies to our day, when indeed it does. No Muslim leader has the authority, nor would any dare, to abrogate a single verse in the Quran or anything that Muhammad taught and practiced as recorded in the Hadith. Nor are the repeated threats and efforts of the PLO and Arab leaders to annihilate Israel met with the international outrage they deserve. Instead, the persistent demands of Arabs for the destruction of Israel are honored as a legitimate cry on behalf of aggrieved Palestinians, who must be appeased through the peace plans that the West intends to impose upon Israel. Peace is not allowed. Those Arabs who recognize that Israel isn't going to be defeated and who want to normalize relations with her for the good of the entire Middle East find it difficult and extremely dangerous to express that opinion and virtually impossible to implement it. The visit of Anwar Sadat to Jerusalem in 1977 was only one of a number of perceived offenses against fundamentalist Islam and would bring about his assassination. A devout Muslim, he went to the Al-Aqsa Mosque to pray, another unforgivable offense. The Saudi royal family has pledged not to do so until Jerusalem is liberated and totally under Muslim control. Old Saudi-Egyptian rivalries were resurrected. It was the last straw when Sadat made peace. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Sheikh Sadaddini Alami, issued a fatwa ordering Sadat to be killed, promising his assassins a place in paradise. What other god or religion incites and rewards cold-blooded murderers? To negotiate in good faith with Israel under any pretext is, in the Muslim mind, the unpardonable sin. Arafat was criticized and had to walk a fine line, deceiving Israel and the West with promises, while not endangering himself at the hands of his fellow Muslims. Even to pretend to make peace with Israel, though it was a ruse to gain her trust in order to destroy her, was deemed an outrage. Consider what Egypt's Al-Dawa, the magazine of the Muslim Brotherhood, had to say. Because of the essential nature of the Jew, it was futile to seek to establish relations with Israeli progressive forces, as Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the PLO, had proposed. In fact, all Jews, like Menachem Begin, had spilled the blood of the Arabs and usurped their lands and homes. The inclination to betrayal and belligerence is deeply implanted in the soul of every Jew. The sentiment expressed by the Muslim Brotherhood cannot be ignored as merely the view of an extremist fundamentalist faction. This is Islam. Any Arab raised in PLO territory or in any other Muslim country will testify that he has been taught to hate Jews and to work for their annihilation from the time he was old enough to understand the slogans and raise his tiny fist in affirmation. After losing the 1967 Six-Day War, a war that had been intended to annihilate Israel, Arab heads of state met in Khartoum, Sudan, August 29th through September 1st, 1967. Under Nasser's leadership, they adopted the infamous 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel, no recognition of Israel. These express the very heart of Islam and have never been rescinded, making even the pretense of negotiations toward peace with Israel a complete fraud. As the peace process continues, Palestinians murder and torch the homes of fellow Arabs suspected of cooperating with Israel. Again, we hear echoes from the past. The same thing was being done in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s to any Arabs who did not join al-Husseini in his riots against the Jews and who favored peaceful coexistence. In fact, at that time, more Arabs were being killed by the Mufti's terrorist followers than either Jews or British soldiers. Quote, mayor-affiliated official, Sheikh Village Mukhtar, rival Arab notable, and even prominent Muslim religious figures, all were victims, end quote, of the Mufti's henchmen. From April 1936, the Mufti's systematic extermination caused the murder of flight from the country of any Arab suspected of less than total loyalty to the ongoing persecution and murder of British and Jews. Now, as then, Muslim terrorists who kill Jews are honored with streets and holidays named after them. This is the glorious foundation for peaceful coexistence. Yet, an ad in the Jerusalem Post boasted that the Jerusalem Heights penthouses were as close to heaven as you can ever get. In fact, they are close enough to the enemy to be destroyed with a few mortar rounds. Will Israel awaken to the grim reality before it is too late? Speaking for God, the prophet Ezekiel condemns the leaders of Israel who have seduced my people, saying peace, and there was no peace, which prophesy concerning Jerusalem, visions of peace for her, and there is no peace. Ezekiel's rebuke, so apropos at that time, is also a prophecy that surely describes Israel and her leaders today. The rewards of peace. With high hopes, the Gaza-Jericho Autonomy Agreement, or the Cairo Agreement, was signed April 5, 1994, by Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, and witnessed by the United States of America, the Russian Federation, and the Arab Republic of Egypt. It is stated to be an implementation of UN Resolutions 242 and 338. Within the framework of the Middle East peace process initiated in Madrid in October 1991. It explicitly requires Israel and the Palestinian Authority mutually to cooperate in combating criminal activity which may affect both sides, and to take all measures necessary in order to prevent acts of terrorism, crime, and hostilities directed against each other, against individuals falling under the other's authority, and against their property, and shall take legal measures against offenders. It is just one more worthless piece of paper among so many. Arafat never intended, nor has the Palestinian Authority even pretended, to keep one provision. It will be no different with his successors. The PA audaciously violates every promise, and the UN turns a blind eye. Instead of demanding compliance, which it could through its superior military power, Israel helplessly accepts the fact, even as terrorism increases, that the PA will never extradite even car thieves, let alone terrorists. The PA police themselves all drive cars stolen in Israel. When Israel attempts to pursue terrorists into their PA hideouts, the world, which never complains about the murder of innocent Israelis, condemns Israel for attacking the poor, downtrodden Palestinians. Palestinian propaganda, aided by world media, has done a masterful job of depicting tiny Israel as cruel Goliath, and the surrounding Muslim enemies with overwhelming numerical superiority as little David, righteously standing up to the evil giant. Alleged peace has brought devastating commercial consequences as well. Palestinians who owe money to Israelis no longer make their monthly payments, leaving the Israelis with no hope of ever collecting. The same is true of millions of dollars in debts owed to Israeli businesses and industry that had been selling to Palestinians on credit. Lawyer Amnon Zikroni, who represents the PA in Israel, has bluntly told Israeli creditors that their chances of recovery are virtually non-existent. And so it is with thieves and hoodlums, who can now steal cars, deal drugs, burglarize and rob with abandon, knowing it is just a few steps to a safe haven within PA territory, where the Israeli police, contrary to signed agreements, can neither follow nor trace them. The touted peace process. While Israel's leaders negotiate peace with Syria, Katyusha rockets fired by Hezbollah terrorists, backed and protected by Syria, rain down upon Galilee. Syrian Defense Minister Mustafa Tlass has called Israel a burden to the U.S. and the rest of the world. Yet, until the recent increase in suicide bombings by terrorists and escalation of hostilities, Israel's leaders had kept the faith for years, continuing to believe that peace could somehow be established with those whose implacable hatred seeks only her annihilation, as Islam requires. The recent attacks upon New York, the Pentagon, Madrid, and London have been the final proof that negotiating with terrorists is tantamount to suicide. In the fall of 1995, just before departing for the Washington summit, Arafat on Jordanian TV reassured Arabs that the 1974 PLO plan of phases, pretend peace to establish a foothold inside Israel from which to launch her final destruction, was right on track. Numerous public speeches by Arafat since the inception of the peace process continued to openly call for Israel's destruction. A number of sources offer videos with footage of Arafat and his spokesman and Islamic clerics over the last 20 years, stating clearly in Arabic to Muslim audiences that all of the peace negotiations are aimed at one thing: the ultimate destruction of Israel. Article 19 of the PLO Charter couldn't be any clearer. Quote, "The establishment of the State of Israel is null and void, regardless of the passage of time," end quote. But the Western world's media and political and religious leaders deliberately close their eyes and ears to the obvious truth and dream up new peace plans as though that is what the Arabs really want. In contrast to most of his colleagues around the world, Mortimer Zuckerman, editor-in-chief of U.S. News and World Report, is not afraid to state the facts. While European and UN leaders were still praising Arafat as a man of peace worthy of the Nobel Peace Prize he had received, Zuckerman wrote plainly, quote, "The man's, that is Arafat's, duplicity is the stuff of legend." Dennis Ross, the former U.S. envoy to the Middle East, wrote, "I've never met an Arab leader who trusts Arafat. Almost all Arab leaders have stories about how he misled or betrayed them." End of quote. Kuwait learned the hard way when Arafat, whom they had propped up with hundreds of millions of dollars, betrayed them by giving Saddam Hussein the vital intelligence for his 1990 invasion of that country. Arafat was sure Hussein would prevail even against the United States and wanted to be on the good side of the victor, not the victims. Yet the West continued to support Arafat financially as it forced Israel to treat him like an honest leader in a mutual effort for peace. The remade Arafat. A number of Arafat's diatribes vowing Israel's destruction were put together on a video by then Chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, Ben Gilman, Republican, New York. Gilman announced he would present the Arafat tapes to the world in a press conference on September 21, 1995. No one from the media was interested. Even more incredible, Israel's ambassador to the U.S., Itamar Rabinovich, pleaded with Gilman not to air the tapes. It might hinder the peace process. And how did this vaunted peace process begin? It is an incredible story of the pressure of world opinion forcing Israel into acceptance of Arafat and the PLO, in spite of the fact that they were in exile in Tunisia, and the PLO charter plainly denied Israel's existence and called for its annihilation, as it still does. No fiction writer could have expected any audience to believe such a scenario, but it happened. Jeff Jacoby explains it in the Boston Globe as well as anyone could. In 1993, following secret negotiations in Oslo, Israel embarked on a peace process designed to elevate Arafat and the PLO to heights of power, wealth, and respect they have never before known. In exchange for Arafat's written promise of peace, the PLO announces the use of terrorism and other acts of violence. Israel agreed to forget the PLO's long history of mass murder and to treat it as the legitimate representative of the Palestinians. The deal was sealed at the White House on September 13, 1993, when Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin gave Arafat his hand and affirmed his new status as Israel's partner in peace. What followed was unprecedented in the history of statecraft. Arafat and thousands of PLO killers, now reconstituted as the Palestinian Authority, entered Gaza and the West Bank in triumph. In short order, Israel transferred virtually every Arab city and town in the territories to Arafat's control. It allowed the Palestinian Authority to assume full administrative power over the Palestinian people. It not only agreed to the creation of an armed Palestinian Authority militia, it supplied the authority with weapons. It began paying Arafat a multi-million-dollar monthly allowance and lobbied internationally for additional financial support. It permitted the Palestinian Authority to build an airport, operate radio and television networks, and deal with other countries as a sovereign power. Netanyahu writes, "My party and I were virtually isolated in our warning that Arafat would not keep his word. We were widely castigated as enemies of peace. Our argument was that handing Gaza over to Arafat would immediately create a lush terrorist haven." Of course, Netanyahu was right. And now Israel has done it again, even more conclusively, with the abandonment of its settlements and defenses in the Gaza Strip. Surrendering Gaza to the enemy. Turning Gaza over to the Palestinian Authority created the very problems Netanyahu foresaw. It left Israeli settlements inside Gaza in a precarious position. In mid-September 2005, a few weeks before this book went to press for its second printing, some 14,000 unarmed Israeli soldiers and police were clearing 25 Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip, patiently evicting residents who refused to leave voluntarily. There was agony and weeping, angry protest, one woman setting herself on fire in sheer frustration. Some reacted violently, but no shots were fired except by Palestinians at an Israeli military outpost. Soldiers wept with those made to leave. The last Gaza town to be evacuated was Netzarim, on the outskirts of Gaza City. It had been the target of frequent attacks by Palestinian militants and was the coastal strip's most isolated Israeli settlement. During the past 5 years, it took an entire Israeli battalion of some 550 soldiers to guard Netzarim settlers, who left quietly and tearfully on armored buses for resettlement in the West Bank. To prevent Palestinians from enjoying the fruit of Israeli labor, Israel destroyed the homes and other structures built by the settlers. The Gaza Strip was finally turned over to Palestinian control for the first time since 1967. Prime Minister Ariel Sharon said it was impossible to watch the evictions without tears, but he insisted that the pullout would make Israel safer. He first proposed this disengagement plan in 2003 to ease Israel's security burden and to help preserve the country's Jewish character by placing Gaza's 1.3 million Palestinians outside Israeli boundaries. Predictably, Palestinians portrayed the pullout as a victory for their suicide bombings and rocket attacks. In an August 19, 2005 interview, Hamas leader Mahmoud al-Zahar boasted, "I stressed that the resistance was what drove the occupation out of the Gaza Strip. We will stand on the ruins of the Israeli settlements and tell our people we have prevailed." There is little question that the bloodshed will resume with completion of Israel's Gaza withdrawal. Benjamin Netanyahu resigned in protest from his position as Minister of Finance. Following are excerpts from his letter of resignation that are important enough to include herein. Mr. Prime Minister, from the moment you presented your disengagement plan to me, I told you I was against a unilateral withdrawal in which Israel would receive nothing in return. Such a withdrawal, I argued, would only strengthen the forces of terror. And worst of all, we are permitting the Palestinians to open a seaport that will enable them to import weapons with abandon. Sadly, the government is blindly moving forward. Just as I feared, Hamas is getting stronger. The terror is continuing. Mortars and Qassams are being fired on our towns, and our enemies boldly declare that they will transfer the rockets that expelled us from the Gaza Strip to Judea and Samaria, and fire them until they achieve their goal of the complete liberation of Palestine. Just as I was convinced in 1993 that the Oslo Agreement would result in rocket attacks from Gaza and terror attacks from Judea and Samaria, I am convinced today that the disengagement plan will strengthen terror and not weaken it. In short, it is becoming crystal clear that the unilateral disengagement is bringing no benefit to Israel. On the contrary, it is endangering our security, dividing the nation, and justifying the untenable demand that Israel return to the indefensible borders of 1967. This is not the way to achieve peace. What is Israel getting in return for its decision to uproot families, destroy their homes, and disinter their loved ones? The remains had to be moved or the Palestinians would desecrate them. In return, we are getting a new base for Islamic terror. After the terror attacks in New York, Washington, Madrid, London, and in the Sinai, the world is beginning to understand that terror must be confronted, not appeased. And Israel, the nation that once showed the whole world how a free people courageously confront terrorism, is now taking a different course. I am unwilling to be a partner to a process that chooses to ignore reality and blindly advances a policy that will create an Islamic terrorist base, that endangers the security of the state, divides the nation, establishes the precedent for Israel's return to the indefensible 1967 lines, and even endangers the future of a united Jerusalem. I therefore submit this letter of resignation. Benjamin Netanyahu. Of course, Netanyahu is right again, as he was in his earlier protest against the entire Oslo process. Tragically, no one seems willing to acknowledge what all sides are ignoring, that this is God's land, a land that He gave to His chosen people 4,000 years ago. Nor is it acknowledged today that just as Maimonides and Ben-Gurion said, no one has the right to take any of this land from Israel, nor is there any option of trading it away. God's judgment is going to fall on all parties, and all the evidence indicates that this terrifying act of divine vengeance will happen in the not-too-distant future. The triumph of propaganda over truth. According to the Washington-based Arab American Institute Foundation, there are an estimated 252,000 Palestinians living in the United States. Some of them who immigrated to America 20 or more years ago were interviewed in mid-August 2005 by Fox News in order to get their reactions to the Israeli pullout of Gaza. Their comments reflect the triumph of propaganda promoted by Muslim media and parroted by most of the media in the West. The Palestinians were kicked out of their homeland 50 or 60 years ago. Palestinians have been stateless since well before 1967's Six-Day War, when Israel seized the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, which it has controlled ever since. If Palestinians are overjoyed to see the Jewish settlers leave, it's because to them it's justice. Stateless since they never had a state. We have earlier dealt with the facts and won't go into them except in summary again. The truth is that these areas were seized by Egypt and Jordan during the aggression by the armed forces of 6 Arab nations, whose stated objective was to drive the Israelis into the Mediterranean and exterminate the newly declared State of Israel. Egypt and Jordan held these territories for 19 years and used them as bases for terrorist attacks against Israel. During those 19 years, instead of giving the Palestinians a state of their own, which no one prevented them from doing, Egypt and Jordan put them in refugee camps. Israel did not build those camps. It was the Arabs who did so to their own people and have kept them there in misery ever since. We have quoted Egypt's dictator Gamal Abdel Nasser and other Muslim leaders who expressed again and again during the arms buildup in the 19 years between 1948 and 1967 their determination to wipe Israel off the map in an invasion that would not leave a Jewish man, woman, or child alive, as Islam requires. As the Arab nations surrounding her were about to attack, Israel had no choice but to make a preemptive strike, which she did in self-defense, defeating her would-be annihilators in the famous Six-Day War. Israel has never threatened or attacked her neighbors. She has acted only in self-defense after every olive branch she has held out has been trampled under the feet of those who have sworn repeatedly, no peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel, no recognition of Israel. Only twisted minds could blame Israel for opposing those who have steadfastly refused to live with her in peace. Yet, Israel is condemned for treating those determined to destroy her as ones who need to be watched closely, regulated, and prevented from accomplishing their goal of annihilation. It is the height of absurdity for enemies to complain about not being trusted and treated as partners in peace, though Israel has attempted to do that as well. Israel is like a man surrounded by a gang of thugs with guns pressed to his head. His captors threaten him, "Sign over your land and house, or we'll kill you. We're going to kill you anyway, but you may buy some time if you give us what we want." To reinforce the threat, one of his children is blown up with a bomb. The media blames the man for provoking his captors by not giving in to their demands. The documents signed and the property taken over legally, the criminals demand, "Now sign over your bank account. We're going to kill you anyway. Our religion requires it, but sign over your bank account and we may delay the execution a bit longer." To reinforce the threat, the man's wife is killed. Looking on, the world cheers the criminals as advocates of justice for the downtrodden, condemns the man for mistreating those determined to kill him and for stealing their land, and promises to help him negotiate peace if he will just give a little more and then a little more to the murderers. This is the madness imposed upon Israel by world powers. Please visit our website, thebereancall.org, to access our radio archives going back to 1999 and our newsletter going back to 1986. We offer daily updates by email or visit us on Facebook or Twitter. Are you looking for information about a specific topic? Go to thebereancall.org and click on Topics at the top of the page. Our online store is thebereancall.com. We offer a wide variety of books, tracts, CDs, and DVDs. Note that most of our ebooks are free. I'm Gary Carmichael. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you can join us again next week. Until then, we encourage you to search the Scriptures 24/7.
Though none go with me, I still will follow. No turning back, no turning back.